The conversation on race and policing began in response to the police killing of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. And this partnership between CSU San Bernardino and the Brennan Center for Justice, we hope to engage in ongoing discussion related to the history and the current context of race, policing, and criminal justice with guests from diverse academic fields and backgrounds.
Thank you so much, folks, for joining us. I'm really grateful to our guests for joining us and for our co-hosts, and to our tech support, Thin Lee, for keeping us going. We're now 121 events. This is 122 in the series. We recognize that California State University San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians, the Yuhaviatam. We recognize that every member of the California State University San Bernardino community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold California State University San Bernardino more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. I want to welcome everybody to our session today, and I want to pass the floor to fellow moderator, Matt Patino.
Hello, everybody. My name is Matt Patino. I am an adjunct professor of history at Crafton Hills College and formerly a police officer with Rialto Police Department here in Southern California. Our guest today is Dr. Amy Barden. She is the chief of Seattle's Community Assisted Response and Engagement Team, or Department, CARE. She is directing the work of Seattle's 911 and CARE community crisis responders. She holds a doctorate in organizational leadership from Vanderbilt University, and she has over 20 years of leadership in human services with organizations in Washington, Oregon, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. You are Dr. Barden. You have a completely different approach in Seattle to, I think, some of what we have heard over the course of our discussions in this forum. Please enlighten us on the CARE program.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a nice introduction. So as I said, I prefer to be called Amy always. And it is important to note that my whole career has been in nonprofit administration, primarily child welfare. I've been around juvenile justice a lot. And as I got older and through some formal education, I came to realize I'm a systems thinker. I'm really pragmatic. I'm deeply optimistic about human nature. And I tend to think that problems, the failures are systems failures, they're by design. And that even if I have a problem sort of showing up in the form of a person or persons, that generally that is a failure of education, of understanding. There's some kind of theory, there's something else going on there. That terminal degree I did was really focused on cognition. And again, the academic stuff was on the side. It was just kind of like an expensive book club. I did one program after another. I was really preoccupied with ethics. And I was raising kids along the way too. I had 4 kids, and so it was just sort of like a big study group. But I have always had this prevailing question, which is more to do with the knowing doing gap. Why don't we do better, right? Why do we escalate commitment to things that don't work? What is going on? And then when you see positive change, either at a macro level or in an individual life, what precipitated that? What enabled that? So I'm deeply interested in, creating that space where we can understand something differently and do better. I was raised by altruistic people. I'm from a heavy construction family. Everybody thinks that my education is ridiculous. Like, you could Google that or go to a library. My family's all in the trades, and they're very, very practical, good people. And I was raised to believe that every life does have equal value. It does, fundamentally. And so that has been a guiding principle. And I also know that people can change. I always knew that. As a young woman, it was more through this faith perspective, these ideas about redemption and what's possible. I've shared before, I was super preoccupied as a young woman with stories of triumph, Elie Wiesel and Nelson Mandela. I had these different eras where I was just so fascinated with people who could put to use the really hard fought lessons and the suffering. And then later, again, in my more evolved self in my 40s, to start to understand something about the brain, about neuroplasticity, that fake it till you make it is a real thing, right? That as we start to behave differently, that actually informs our thinking and what we believe about ourselves, and then vice versa, right? The more I have this belief, the more it sort of will manifest in my daily life. So that's sort of the Amy context. I wound up in this public safety space because those 4 kids grew up. The older 2 had finished college. They came back to Seattle. I had been working in the Midwest, again, going to school in Tennessee. And then I've got a youngest at Pepperdine and a kid at school in Seattle right now, 2 undergrads. And so that was why I came back. They moved back and I thought, okay, cool, I'll go work in the Northwest again. I had been out of Seattle for 6 years, 2015 to 2021. And for the first time, I'm kind of a free agent. I'm in this little apartment. I'm walking everywhere and working downtown and sleeping 6 consecutive hours, and felt quite renewed in the second half of life. And I was stunned at what I was passing on the streets. I did not understand what had happened. I didn't know anything about fentanyl yet and the impacts of. I didn't understand how, in a city this wealthy and bright and compassionate, why do I have all these folks dying on the sidewalk? And I was deeply troubled too to just watch the passersby, not looking down, to realize this is completely normalized here, as it has become in other places. And I think I had a more sophisticated understanding of the role of local government and local policy. So my instinct wasn't to go to my nonprofits that I knew. My instinct was to go to city government and figure out what don't we understand here? What is the policy failure? And so I reached out to someone I knew and just wound up in a conversation with this new mayor, Bruce Harrell. He was just wrapping up the end of his first year. We're a degree removed from each other. So he was kind of a familiar character to me. He'd been a council person for a long time. And again, is toward the end of his career. He's running for a second term right now, but he's got kids and grandkids in this city and has deep moral conviction about public health and public safety. So we had this conversation, informal. At the end of it, he just got it in his mind that I should do something for his administration. And I've shared before, I really did crack up. I do not like politics. I have had no ambition around the public sector at all. I'm sort of suspicious of, I think, power and profit both, which was why I was in the nonprofit sector. But his office persisted. And over the next couple of months, they had a couple different ideas for me. And I didn't know why I was complimented, but not interested. I had a good job at the time. And then one day, the opportunity was presented. It was explained to me that 911 had been pulled out of police. I didn't understand that that was in the wake of defund. I just thought it was to have better objectivity and independence in dispatch. And that there weren't really any business supports, that you had 160 folks just kind of hanging out without payroll and HR and all the things that you would need. And then that $1.5 million had been allocated by the city council for what was called the dual dispatch pilot, which sounded like an alternative to policing. And again, I'm aware of this sort of national trend in 2021. And more because I got preoccupied with the idea of using 911 data to design first response. I had learned RMD. I never thought I'd get to use it again, in my career. And so I started to realize, oh, this is public facing. I could pull these data sets and start to really look at, what are the corollary factors here, like substance use and crime, for example. How many times am I dispatching to unhoused persons? There's no way to know actually by the data. So that's what captured me. I was backgrounded like a police chief because 911 is in the West Precinct. So operationally, I am police adjacent. But I wasn't really interviewed. In the end, again, it was more an instinct that it would be good to try to help and to just do something different might be good for me personally. So they just sort of dropped me in the department. I showed up in a 911 roll call like, hey, I'm Amy. What are we doing here? And now I'm about 2 years into the job. And the more I know about policing and public safety, the more I think it was really funny how I showed up. I mean, Matt, you would understand, right? These folks are used to chain of command. They're sort of the bottom of the chain of command and have been really treated like admins. This is secretarial work rather than, no, this is the first responder. And how this first moment goes, how this call goes, the discretion, the cultural intelligence, the emotional intelligence of that dispatcher is absolutely going to inform what happens. And so I was very obsessive about it. If you like system design, to sit on the floor in 911 and actually see the gaps, the overlaps, the failures, but then also the heroics. When something goes well, why is that? The first time I presented publicly was about 3 months in. I had been, again, just consumed by 911 data. I sort of plugged myself into the national movement in Transform 911. That's primarily University of Chicago Health Lab, and then Policing Project, Georgetown Kicks, Harvard, these different sort of entities looking at alternative response. And people were very gracious to share with me quickly what was going well, what we're not sure of, what the pitfalls can be in design. And where it gets interesting politically is the first time that I spoke to the council, this was in June, it will be 2 years. I didn't know who I was talking to. I, again, did not know how bureaucracy was usually done. And I just presented. They gave me 30 minutes. I took 9. And I put up this simple Venn diagram. We have police. I've got a police co-response unit. I've got a fire department. I've got mobile integrated health, which is the fire co-response unit. But half of the calls, half of the 900,000 calls don't sit in either of these two buckets. They're the stuff in the middle. They are social work calls. And so I praised law enforcement. I've been out with police here. I actually was surprised, as someone who's really from the behavioral health social worker side. I didn't know about CIT training. I was surprised how upskilled and cross-trained the patrol officers were. However, many evenings I've got about 58 law enforcement officers in the city. So even if you think they're appropriate to send, I don't have them. And I've got escalating violence in Seattle, 2020 to 2023. I think Washington was second only to Colorado in rates of escalating violent crime. And so I understand there's a need for law enforcement. I praised the fire department, mobile integrated health. I learned a lot about fentanyl quickly. And in that first year on the job, we lost 1,388 people to overdose here. Those are preventable deaths. And I can see that I'm not responding appropriately to this particular substance. I'm treating it like I would have treated, even heroin or alcoholism. This is completely different. The runway is different. And so I learned that praising law enforcement and supporting them and saying, no, we're just going to design basically the missing piece. We need three different divisions in public safety, and we need to act together in a coordinated way. I learned quickly that we're all interacting with the same folks routinely, that ideally there's some calls where I would have police, fire, and care all. And it caught a lot of attention. I felt like it was C-SPAN. It was surprising to me that people really took notice when I spoke. But I think Seattle was looking for this third option, that it had been either abolitionist or law and order, and there'd been all of this fighting and it was so combative. But we do tend to be idealistic here in Seattle, philosophically ideal sometimes. And again, I'm a pragmatist. I want to get to that compassionate society that is not in such need of law enforcement, but I know I've got to design forward to that place, invest in prevention, invest in diversion, provide, again, if there's a carceral system, it should always have been rehabilitative. It's not. And so I am moving with urgency toward that future state that I can see. But I do sit in 911 and I understand when I have a call and it's a human trafficker, I'm not going to send my care crisis responders. So the pilot took liftoff. I initially had 6 responders. Joe Cooper is with us. He will always be one of the original 6. He was actually a community service officer who came over. He was a supervisor. And that was a real asset for me because he already knows the radio, right? He already has trust and credibility with the police department. So we launched the pilot. And I didn't know why it was called dual dispatch. And then I learned it's because nobody had conferred with labor here. The idea was we've just got to sidestep this conversation. It's going to be intractable. That was the most naive part of me. I didn't understand how directly I was impacting 4 different unions, including my dispatchers guild. But I was very candid as I met with different leaders, including the police officers guild. I'm Amy. I just got here. I'm sorry nobody talked to you. But I also know officers do not like going to these calls, and that the average response time to priority 3 calls is 123 minutes, right? So that's kind of a non-response. And so I got this initial agreement, MOU, to grow to 24. And now we're about 15 months in. I was very measured publicly, saying I'm not going to recommend expansion until I can see that it's working. I want to know that the public thinks this is useful. I want to analyze, am I getting more calls to 911 because people trust that I've got another response I can send other than a gun and a badge? And I did hold the line. It was interesting. Often the press would say, you know, what are your outcomes going to be, or how do you know it's working? And I was always quick to say, I'm not going to have outcomes. You know, I'm going to be able to triage. I'm going to have outputs. I'm going to have response times and calls for service and things like that. But an outcome would be, am I diverting someone into a rehabilitative path? Am I breaking a cycle of addiction? Am I bringing somebody into housing stabilization where then they can actually continue in a directional way down a path? And at the time I started, we just didn't have that. I didn't even have a 24/7 sobering center. So I think that in that way, my style has been useful to Seattle, to be more honest about why things are the way they are. Sometimes it is a staffing shortage, but more often than not, we've got a philosophical disconnect or ethical inconsistency. Why do I send priority 1 lights and sirens if somebody's threatening to jump? But if somebody, I know they've overdosed the last 7 days in a row, that they're likely to die this month, but I don't consider that, you know, I'm going to use coercive tactics or nothing at all. And that's just inconsistent, that this is a threat to life and I should treat it like an emergency. So it has gone well. I am holding the line that police, care, and fire, that we need to design together, and that we should continue to scale up based on the data, right? So if in a future state I didn't have all these fentanyl overdoses, then I should be able to sort of reduce headcount to that unit. But we need to learn to be flexible and adaptive. And then the last thing I'll share in short order is, by the end of the first year, I started out sort of strategic and academic and intellectual. And by the end of the first year, I realized, oh, I don't think that we believe people can change. I don't think people actually understand that no matter how far gone, you know, how deep into a crisis of crime or cycle of crime or crisis someone is, that they can change. That's just scientific. Sometimes you need clinical support, medical support, but there is an explanation. And I feel like when the country gets to that place where any part of the system we looked at, is it designed to heal someone, to support positive change? When we get there, it's going to change everything. Because right now, most things are designed, the carceral system, you're more likely to have your trauma compounded, you're more likely to become a better criminal. A lot of my friends who have done time tell me that. And when people elect into rehabilitation, it's often they're an exception to the rule. It's not designed that way. And so it's been very validating to speak to lots of different groups, lots of different demographics, then I think strike that chord of what do we believe about life, and are we willing to do what's required to get somebody into a better place? So Matt, you have smart questions now?
Oh, I have many. We talked a little bit before we went live. You talked a little bit about abolition versus reform, and those of us who are organizing as part of the organizers, even we struggle with this, you know, this question. You know, the forum started in the wake of the George Floyd killing, and so nationally the question was abolition versus reform. What strikes me as very interesting and kind of unique about your situation in Seattle is we have tended to focus on the police end, but you've chosen to bring in the fire department. Why is that?
Yes. So there was a study done here, a Nick Jr. study that looked at 1.2 million calls 2017 to 2019, and found that of that 1.2 million calls, 80% had nothing to do with law enforcement, nothing. 6% only at the time had any kind of felony aspect. So I am a loud advocate for what I call criteria-based dispatch, which means in 911, rather than looking at hundreds of calls, there should be this primary question: does this necessitate a gun and a badge? Is there an actual academic reason to believe that it might? And right now in Seattle, some calls do, 100%.
Yeah.
But if I can rule that out, I should always send an unarmed responder. And I've been doing that, right? The people always ask about sending an unarmed responder, like someone could get shot. And I always say, the fire department was established here in 1884. You know, they went to 200,000 calls last year. Those are unarmed responders.
Right.
And that's, I think, the elegance of my design. Albuquerque's done the same thing. Denver is that if you're on the same channels, Joe would tell you, if he doesn't feel safe to proceed or like there's an issue, he calls backup. He hands off, the same as fire does every single day. And so I just see that as a huge unit, the fire department. Again, primarily, I think I heard it's like 6% of the calls are fires. It's mostly medical.
Mhm.
And my contention also is that generally, if it is an emergency or something high acuity, of course there's a mental health aspect, right?
Right.
I'm a loud advocate for co-response for that reason, because I feel like even if I'm just somebody observing something horrific, there is a
Mhm.
mental health impact to that. So the more we can bolster this sort of community responder model, in a perfect world, I wish I had 200 care responders who could flow into co-response as well. And that hasn't been designed anywhere, but I think that would be so awesome, because then if there was another COVID where you've got lots of medical issues, but also mental health impact, they could just flow over to the work. Or if you did have something where you needed basically a social worker in a ballistic vest, could I have responders upskilled to go ride with police in those situations? Right now it's static. That's 5 units. This is 7 units. Care is this
Yeah.
many units, right? And I feel like that's just not a good design.
Um, the um, the 911 service you have, I'm assuming, so please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm assuming that when you got there, this is a computer-aided dispatch model that prioritizes calls based on a pre-existing algorithm. Um, have you gone in to change that, or is there now a human element that is kind of distinguishing this is the call for this group?
Yeah. Yes, it always was human centric.
Okay.
There's call takers and then there's dispatchers. So the call takers have all these different protocols and criteria. We're not using AI in Seattle 911 the way some, especially fire dispatch centers are, where you've got
Mhm.
medical protocols, right?
Right.
If they say this, these are your next 3 questions. We're looking at that. It's a little bit challenging again, because 911, over those million calls that come in, wow, they are varied.
Yeah.
And what I would like to see is, again, the dispatcher elevated to use better discretion, to be able to use what we understand about different neighborhoods or different cultures. It's interesting how these career professionals, I remember early on, somebody said, well, Amy, we generally know if someone's lying to us. And I was like, how? But it does make sense to me because of the way the brain patterns, right? I'm used to, this is the range of, kind of
Mhm.
a regular response to this moment. And so I think that part is really interesting academically. But yeah, I am unique in the country. There are lots of different pilots, alternative response pilots. There's a few other third public safety departments. Again, I point to Albuquerque. I'm the only one with oversight of 911. And initially, everyone was sort of teasing me about that, because those are two really big separate jobs.
Yeah.
However, and I felt sorry for myself a little bit, but then I realized uniquely I can compel the change in dispatch. And if you do not have that buy-in, it doesn't matter how good the responder team is, right? It's dispatch that's always going to divert it away. And if there's not trust in the unit, they won't do it. The default, all 911 dispatchers are trained to be cynical. They are. You're trained to imagine the worst case scenario
Yeah.
and to mitigate that risk. I think that's very human, to want to keep everyone safe. And so I'm trying to balance, I have this fundamental optimism that I think most of the time, and again, there's a lot of literature to suggest I'm right, most of the time, there is a peaceful way through this moment. And so I feel like, Seattle was kind of behind, and now I feel like we have way more momentum, because 911 folks have heard me talk about this. They've helped me to co-design the response. They're informing the design. They know what call types were really not meeting the needs appropriately. And then I can hold people to account. Joe would tell you initially, why aren't we dispatching the care response, right?
Yeah.
And I had to really address liability issues. I've got you. You're safe.
Mhm.
We're designing this with police. Police have their own training videos about when to call care. So we had to start to build up that trust. But there was a day, and you can see it in the data, when the 1 year report is released, you can see it's kind of like buy-in, 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 and then you see it start to spike. And that was the day, I sort of blew people's hair back in a meeting, that I am not going to recommend this investment if we won't use it. And that is my expectation, that we are actually using these new care responders, that people are languishing and suffering on the streets. And it is not right to not take advantage of the opportunity to get people help. So
Jeremy, you have a question.
Yeah, I was hoping to also bring in Joe, and thank you so much, Amy and Matt, for leading us off. I wanted to hear, because there's so much to dig into here. We could be easily here for 3 hours. But I just wanted to hear from Joe, sort of a typical call or an ideal call, or both, or sort of how when things go smoothly. Because it seems to me like this may be, we talked about fire and EMT responders, and it's funny, we're a little ahead of the curve. We have a 911 operator as a previous host on our team of moderators, and we currently have also a former firefighter, Stan Futch. I wish they'd been here, but they'll enjoy listening in, and they'll probably want to call you guys back. But in terms of at that intersection, it seems like to some extent you're making the road as you walk it in terms of this new type of program, although you have these other antecedents and these other examples of fire and EMTs. But I was wondering if Joe could tell us a little bit about a typical call, Joe Cooper, and your place within the organization, an ideal call, a typical call, and just a little bit more of what these look like.
Sure. And can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay, perfect. I think it's so hard to say what a typical call is because all of our calls are so different every day. It can be the same call type where it's somebody expressing suicidal ideations, but that call is going to go a lot of different ways. We've had calls where people have expressed SI because they have to move and they have some physical issues. So we really focused on assisting that person with some basic life skills of, hey, this is how I would pack my apartment. I go from this desk and I go around the room, but also injecting a little bit of humor, injecting a little bit of support in the ways of maybe you can take 30 minutes to watch a TV show because you said you like TV, pack some things on your bed, and then you can go pack another box. We can't stay here forever, but we're going to provide those resources. But we've also had another call that was an SI call that someone had actually jumped off of a 7th floor of a building, and we just were providing emotional support to the partner in that call. So there really isn't a typical call that we go on. They're all so different. I think as far as outcomes, I was asked that in my interview when I started over here, what's a good outcome? And I think that depends on who you ask. I think that depends on, a great outcome could be us spending 4 to 8 hours on a call so police don't have to invest that time in there. They could go handle higher priority calls. I think a great outcome could be really client or community member centered, where did we get you what you were looking for today? I joke with some of the team members, wouldn't it be funny if we could somehow ask folks that we meet in the community and assist for like an Uber review, right? How did this call go for you? So I think for me, that's really one of the most important things about what we're doing is what are the people we're serving? How are they sort of responding to what services or support that we provided them? I hope that answers sort of what you're asking.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that was some of the bigger things also. Thanks, Joe. And while Amy was talking, I got to thinking a lot, and especially with your personal situation that you shared in terms of the proximity of this to law enforcement. And I may be sort of bringing up the elephant in the room, but in terms of, you mentioned scaling up, and Joe, you just mentioned this sort of something that could be a kind of data point, and that is the response that people have, the positive, negative response. In terms of scaling up, it sounds again, the elephant in the room could be the sort of budget question. I remember in the wake of the George Floyd killing, there were a lot of really serious conversations going on, and a lot of very prominent law enforcement officials saying, we don't want to be going on these calls. We wish you could bring somebody else in to take these calls. And then when it came time to sort of talk turkey and say, okay, well, this is what it looks like. Well, sorry, it looks something like a program like this. And if there's a limited pie to divide, or if there's a sort of if this is where the funding will come from, that's where things get very real all of a sudden, and you have actors such as police unions and that kind of thing who say, back off. We yes, we said we believe other alternative responses are viable and should be deployed, but then when it comes time for the money conversation, that may be where things become untenable. But is that sort of the elephant in the room in terms of scaling up, or is this a question of time and proof of concept, and then that conversation happens later?
No, it's absolutely about money. and territorialism. I mean, I asked myself the first year, again, every night I'd go home with some new question. The more that I understood, I thought a lot about iteration, about the first fire or first police department, right? So you've got Boston, 1838, how later you've got this iteration that there are new emergencies. And so we designed for that. Fire evolves to become more medical, right? When you think about cardiac and health, all of these different iterations. And I go back and think, okay, by the 60s, I bet half of these calls were really to do with human behavioral issues. You've got PTSD. I think my uncle fought in Vietnam. You've got escalating rates of dependency. You've got escalating rates of suicide, actually. You know, you can just sort of look at the behavioral health data to think, why would we not have set up the third thing then? By the data, who best to send? I'm always trying to remind people, just take a step back, think about what the caller is describing and match it. Who would you send? I often say, who would you send if it was someone you love? You know, so if somebody is having suicidal ideation and they don't have a weapon, who would you send to talk to the person? And it's just such a practical question, but I think the answer is labor. It's territorialism. You know, it's that you've got these two very weighty departments just continually trying to upskill their people and cross-train their people. My defensiveness of police is that we have compelled them to do that. Seattle specifically, we make them go to everything. We compel them to go to homeless response. That is not okay, and they don't want to do it. They don't want to do that. The officers that I know all over the country are well aware that no matter how great their skill set, that uniform, that badge can escalate someone. And there's also a healthy respect that if I want to be a clinical social worker, I'm probably not going to go to the police academy. They're just different disciplines. And so, you know, right now I'm in a little bit of a labor fight in Washington State, because what I'm suggesting, we brought forward legislation to say absolutely collective bargaining, absolutely impact bargaining. But once it's determined this is not police body of work, then that third public safety department needs to be able to just scale and grow a head count in order to respond appropriately to the designated body of work. So I am very pro-labor. Again, that is my background. My care responders right now are actively organizing with one of two unions. I've got a dispatchers guild, a really, really good relationship. But I often say human suffering cannot be a body of work issue. I was in a conversation last year talking about who gets to do what transport. So I've got community service officers, I've got Health One, I've got care, I've got police. And finally, I paused the conversation and said, it is never going to be okay with me that somebody drives by someone languishing in crisis, because that's not my body of work. Not okay. We need to articulate, who do we call first? Who has first right of refusal? But many of us we're first responders. We should be skilled and cross-trained. We need behavioral health training across all three public safety departments. And so that's just a different way of thinking about it. But the politics, the territorialism, seeking power and profit, the self-interest. Again, when I'm spending all of my days actually watching unnecessary suffering and death, it is deeply troubling to me, because I feel like whoever you are, whatever your background, whatever your affiliation, you might need to call 911, or someone you love might need to call. And you should not be happy that right now, even if it's a gun to somebody's head, it takes me more than 11 minutes to get an officer there. And that is not going to improve in the foreseeable future. The only path to improvement is to diversify first response. And you can see real positive impacts in Albuquerque as they grew Albuquerque community safety. And Mariella, you know, who basically laid the framework and was the original leader of Albuquerque, she was a great mentor for me. She said, Amy, we were not going to diminish the police department to grow this other thing, because it would become politicized. And it also sort of misses the point, the pragmatism of the design. You know, I'm just trying to respond to the calls appropriately. And now you see, I know Chief Medina, while their police staffing improved, morale improved, use of force is down, property crime dropped precipitously. And that unit's been to 80,000 calls, and they really do operate more like unarmed law enforcement or fire. It is a third unit that's well respected. So I think it's the best model. I have there are a lot of models in the country where I respect, where you have some good outcomes, but I feel like once I outsource to community-based organizations that don't have the liability protection, the quality assurance, and frankly, the budget, the general fund budget, there's just too much volatility. I mean, I watched Atlanta PAD. They were in a dogfight last year to even exist, right? And that's so frustrating to me. I've seen the same thing in Denver. I've seen the same thing in Portland. I feel like once it becomes really political, and again, it's, you know, public safety and institutions or this, it just doesn't work. It kind of falls apart.
I think it's probably very easy to politicize from the public
Yeah.
viewpoint. And you said, you know, you didn't really come in with, you know, this is the list of goals. You wanted to see outcomes as they happened. So my question is how is the community responding? Are they seeing the positives, or are you able to sell the positives to them?
Yeah. Yeah. It was interesting how quickly the program and me actually personally became recognizable in Seattle, because I didn't have a year to socialize the idea, to make the rounds. I don't have a public affairs arm or anything. It was just me really saying yes to every conversation, trying to show up in every community group. I mean, anybody who has asked to understand the philosophy behind it, the operations, I've shown up. Fortunately, the press have been amazing. You know, I definitely level set and said, I'm going to speak to everyone. I don't care who's writing about what. If you're interested in my space, you have my candor and my transparency. I'll tell you as much as I know. And so it became a joke here that I'm like the one thing that Seattle agrees on. But I think the folks who have been very pro law enforcement and frustrated, you know, police were without a contract here for 3.5 years. They were the 16th highest paid department. Again, imagine that in a state like Washington, there's no comparison in what's required. And so I think the fact that I was trying to strengthen and stabilize that department so that they could focus on the work that only they could do, uh, I think that sort of ingratiated me with that side of the aisle. And then I think there are a lot of people who have known that we need something else, have longed for it, have demanded it. And I represent that the future path forward. I am a reformer. You know, I don't think of myself as an agitator because I smile all the time, but I am absolutely an agitator up here. I am. I believe that you have to take meaningful steps forward and again, illuminate and inform public opinion about what's actually happening. We have a lot of human trafficking in North Seattle. And I was in a meeting where, again, it's so frustrating to the public because they can see what's going on. It's very clear, right? Where the crime is, where the crisis is. We can see it. Why can't you do anything? And I was in a forum where somebody was talking about police staffing shortages. And finally, I stood up and said, it's actually not that. You know, I could have all the police in the world. There's no mechanism to approach a young woman and say, hey, are you being sold? You know, like that's not a thing. And again, even if it was a thing and she says yes, then what? Right? I have no rehabilitative path. That is a very specific, vulnerable population. And so I'm helping, my son says I'm trying to help people know how to think about the problem. And I think that that's right. I think that generally we all agree on the same things. I think that it's fundamentally human to long for a compassionate, peaceful society where everybody can go about their business. And I do think it's interesting, my popularity in law enforcement generally. I mean, I've spoken to police chiefs all over the place and in Canada, and so then there's that actual experience I have with the rank and file, and then there's this labor conversation, which is she's skimming, right? It's so weird to me. I'm like, you're the same group, you know, like let's just, but again, I guess it's just about negotiation.
Joe, I am curious what the response is like when you arrive and maybe they're expecting police or they're expecting fire, and here comes somebody from this third unit. I don't know anything about you. What's the reception like?
Yeah, I think right now most of our calls, I think about 80% of our calls we're going to as a secondary response. So law enforcement is likely there first. But part of that is that sometimes officers will call us and say, hey, either we know this person or we know this situation a little better than what the information on our MDT says. We know we're going to escalate them. Can you all go first? So we do get that a little bit. A lot of the times when we're out on the street doing a premise, we'll do an on view. And people, you know, because we do have radios, we do have bags with us carrying supplies. Some people, we are in a uniform, although it's a lot softer. We're not as militarized looking. Some people do think that maybe we're asking them to leave and we're just checking on them. We try to let them know that, and we'll say, we'll see you next time. But I do think community members in general at large, there have been times when we moved over to East Precinct, one of my partners and I walked down the street just doing a premise, and people that lead like a housing business organization, they yelled out the window like "Care Team's finally here" and started cheering, you know? So I think, as Amy kind of said, people are very excited that we're able to sort of move around the city now. And yeah, it just depends on who it is, what the call is. The reception is going to be a little different, but I think most people, officers are sort of explaining, hey, these folks know the resources. These folks are able to support you better, potentially, longer, potentially than I can. And most people are a little bit more excited to hear from us.
This question, I think, for both of you, since you mentioned you have MDTs, but mobile data terminal, where a lot of these calls are coming through, plus radios, are you in a position as the third department? Are you in a position where you can, I don't like the term, but it's the only one I can think of, where you can cherry pick a call, where you can look and go, that one's for us. That's a care call. Maybe I should grab that now.
Yeah, it's a good question. So again, what I'm trying to do is strengthen and elevate the discretion in dispatch. Because what happens in effect is you've got all these secondary response units. So again, police have their community service officers. You know, you have things like victim support. We've got, again, mobile integrated health. And then there's different, we've got lead, right? We've got different programs adjacent. And what's been happening is a patrol officer is trying to think, wait, who else could I ask for? This isn't me, you know, who else is online? And it's impossible for them to keep current the compendium of resources. So in a perfect world, my dispatcher would say, Care, this is you, go. And they go, right?
Okay.
And if they get on scene and something new is understood, then radio it back.
Yeah.
But that's one of the things I'm trying to work with. We lose time as we debate who best to send. And so I want to make sure that that dispatcher is actually the one who has the authority to deploy the right configuration. In a perfect world, in a future state, I would like to know if I'm sending care out and I know that there's substances involved, why can't I call the lead specialist, right? The diversion specialist right there to meet us on scene so that there's a swift, elegant handoff. You know, sometimes people need treatment on demand. They need intake. And so King County is investing in crisis care centers and things like that, which will really help. Because what we were doing when I arrived is we just take everyone to the ED.
Yeah.
And, you know, for what? They
Yeah.
can't, at the time, you couldn't even get methadone there. So I felt like, why would I take someone post overdose to what? To get hydrated? You know, this is just not a good use of resources. So the care, I mean, one of the jokes has been that I'm the toughest chief because the care responders, the original ones, I'm like, nobody's in an office. Like in between calls, you are out. We know where the crisis is. You should be at least forming strong relationships, get to know the businesses, more like police beats back in the day.
Right.
We
Yeah.
don't really have that anymore. And I
Yeah.
really do believe in place-based, person-based strategy. That the more I understand, you know, my partners, or again, the folks who are chronically struggling, the more likely I am to get them to yes. So one of the organizing principles of care is that we will always be consent-based. Always. I say that all the time because I'm fearful if I get hit by a bus, that's going to be lost. You know, even like involuntary treatment, I get asked about, but I feel like the minute I go down this coercive path, you're effectively just creating another enforcement department, maybe a softer one, but I want that line really articulated. And then the other philosophical thing is if you think about just getting it in the right order, if we invest in prevention first, and then early intervention, deflection, diversion, if you exhaust those options thoroughly before you use coercive tactics, that's the solution, right? And I do know a lot of folks who have said, Amy, if I hadn't been arrested, if I hadn't been booked, if I hadn't had this much time, I would still be doing these crimes or in this crisis, or I would be dead. I do hear that. And so I understand for a portion of the population, again, you need something that is not collaborative in order to intervene. But I think that should be a very statistically small part of the population. And that generally, especially when you have an incentive and a deterrent. So think about here, our drug diversion court is pre-adjudication, which I love, because if you're successful, it's as though it never happened, right? And people who elect into that process, which is comprehensive supports into recovery, wildly successful here. But the judge tells me, yeah, it works because they know they're going to do time otherwise. You know, most people would not have said, yes, let me try this. Again, because they're pretty far downstream. They already have, these are felony charges. So I like that model. And again, I'm a parent. It's sort of how parenting works, right?
Yeah. I was a cop a lifetime ago, so I know things have changed, but back when I was on the street, if we arrested somebody for being under the influence, it was an easy arrest. You know, we were all DREs. You could recognize this person's under the influence. And back then there was a required minimum sentencing. So the DAs loved it because this looks great on their stat sheet. So my question is, the other half of the system, are they buying into this as well?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the most fun about being me. I'm like middle child from a big family, and I talk to everybody. Like once I learned that there's another challenge, the prosecuting attorney in King County has become, they've all become my friends, really. We all talk all the time. I know a lot of judges. I'm looking at the public defenders, because to your point, until we have consensus about what I'm talking about, right? What is the appropriate intervention? And sometimes we do a disservice to someone. I see it every day. We'll refer someone to involuntary treatment. The person is talked into going in voluntarily to be screened, so they walk right back out. Then I have many experiences now where I see that that person is deceased the next day.
Yeah.
That happens all the time. And so I think it's the most complex part of the work. Autonomy is so important, self-determination, civil liberties. However, if I think that the person, that actual harm is going to befall them, I've got to do my part to get somebody help. And again, I've accumulated so many sad stories where I knew this person was always wandering in traffic and muttering with a blanket over his head, and then he's hit and killed. And it's very inspiring to me to be in community and have that message back to me all the time. We don't want to punish this person, but we don't know how to help them, and to feel the collective grief. We know we're failing people. And so I do think that the criminal justice part of this, we need dramatic reforms there. In my prior career, I had talked a lot about how asylums were bad in the 60s, no question, bad. So we closed them, but we did not replace them with what was promised. There were not community-based resources. There still are not. Those folks overwhelmingly became incarcerated or homeless. And so when I think about the system, that's what I'm stressing: reform it. But I'm not aware of a society ever in human history where you didn't have some folks who would need inpatient treatment or comprehensive supports and help. And I do not believe that that is antithetical to compassion, or to autonomy. I feel like it was funny. I was lecturing at University of Washington, and somebody asked me something. We were talking about like prohibition and basically, can you incent sobriety? And it was an interesting conversation, but I said, listen, we've got to get back to a place where we realize that addiction is not a desirable state, whatever we're talking about. That when I lose my autonomy to act in my own best interest, when something's interfering with my relationships, you can be talking about gambling or shopping or porn or alcohol or whatever, that's not a desirable state. And that is not the same thing as vilifying the person having that experience. And that's a really important point. So again, it's how and why and when do we interrupt, and to what end? And I just think, like, sentencing guidelines, ridiculous. That they spent in a place does not at all indicate change. So I feel like that whole thing needs to be overhauled too. So I feel like I'm never going to retire. One thing leads to the next. But I just really do believe and observe every day that people do change. They do. And it's the same basic components when the change happens. It's that there's compassion and support, there's accountability, that we've got a system that understands there is relapse. I don't know anybody who just improves in a straight line, where it's like, I'm going to kick this habit and then there's no relapse. It's just not a thing. And so I think that's challenging too, from a design perspective. But, I'm starting to say folksy things like good case management looks like love, because it does. It generally, somebody's reflecting to me, your life has value. You were doing so well. What happened? And I think the folks that I've known who've been incarcerated for a really long time or struggled for many, many years, that's what they tell me, that it took a minute to become an authority on my own behavior, my own patterns. Why am I doing this? And so, it just doesn't need to be the way that it is. It just doesn't. And I think that the disconnect between what academics understand, medical practitioners, clinical practitioners, folks in criminal justice, there's all these different disconnects. And I'm like, just stop throwing your white papers at me. We all know the same things, about what it is to be human, how hard it is to change, when I've been deeply discouraged, and how did I get through that moment? And I know that's simplification in a way, but the othering needs to stop. because it is
Right.
degrees of similar human experiences, in my opinion.
So you mentioned the program, yours in Seattle and the one in Albuquerque.
Mhm.
Is this a model that can work for larger cities like Los Angeles or New York?
Yeah, yes, it must. There's a Council of State Governments and National Commission Expanding First Response that I'm on. And then also Georgetown has an alternative response research collective that's 9 different jurisdictions. We're trying to get closer to a blueprint. And that's what I'm always suggesting. If you have at least this many calls for service, I guarantee half of them would benefit from a care type response. ACS Durham has the HEART program, and we have got to treat it like first response, because we have continued to suppress the role of case management, social work, behavioral health. Those folks aren't paid, they're not well resourced. People don't contemplate liability protection. Again, they haven't had the support of big unions, right, to
Yeah.
advocate. And so I feel like there's urgency. I'll be in DC next week, and that's what I keep stressing. I feel like this needs to be federally legislated, because otherwise it's always going to rise and fall on the budget, on political ideology. It's funny how I feel very well embraced in conservative circles, because I'm always talking about redemption and change and human life and value, and and like, let's move this forward together. And I've been supported in progressive circles as well, but I think that's how it should be. It should be that we all care about people who have fallen behind the unnecessary loss of life. And I think the best model in smaller jurisdictions, so like, yes, LA should have care. And I talk to San Francisco and Portland and similar cities all the time. Just set up a third public safety department, rebrand this thing, right? Because there was a lot of harm done, I think, by the antagonism. Although I understand what it was anchored in, it just set us back a little bit as a movement, where it was no longer pragmatically, who do you send to the call? That should have been the
Yeah.
question. If you look at the organizing documents for my department, I've made a joke that it's pretty much like, whereas police are the worst, whereas, I mean, that was the premise. And I think that sort of deficit thinking it's just not useful. That was never the issue. The issue was, back to my earlier point, we never set up the new first responder to appropriately respond to the call for service, right? We never did
Right.
that. That was our
No.
societal failure. We should fix that.
Yeah.
Boy, I'm on a tear today, Matt. I was using you as, this is therapy now, I think.
Oh, okay. Jeremy, do you have any other questions?
I think I just a comment, a huge thank you to Joe and to Amy for the work that you're doing. And I think that Matt and I are historians, and Mary, our other co-host, is a sociologist. You noted a second ago, Amy, we all know this stuff. I think in certain circles we all know this stuff, but we also have a very powerful engine of, and Matt is familiar with this, the narrative around law enforcement, the propaganda kind of stuff that comes out from Hollywood and lots of other forums that I think you're up against in some respect, in terms of getting not in a necessarily combative way, although that may happen, but in a sense of telling this story. And I'm really eager to have this story told more and more and more, so that people recognize the human element and what Joe sees, and the data element and what you're putting together, Amy, and bringing those together, so that this really clear narrative of success and alternative and human survival is out there. And I'm really grateful that you both came on to join us to share this, and I hope this gets out more and more. Well, I hope that we can host more folks who are doing the kind of work that you're doing in places like Oakland, as you recommended, and other contexts as well. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Again, these forums make all the difference. It really is just one conversation at a time. And I think there are very few people who can comment on the system, sort of objectively. My outsiderness initially, I know there were a lot of people that, especially at 911, it's like, you haven't even called 911. What can you do for us here? But I think people don't understand. Often that's where the innovation sits. It's somebody who has enough understanding, especially systems understanding, to start to amplify what the issues are. And then the other thing I would just say in closing is, we really do need to put aside self-interest and ego and territorialism and,
Yeah.
our own, in academia, it's like our own significance if a thing is published. I'm looking for ethical, moral leadership right now. I love like John Rawls, Veil of Ignorance stuff. I love thinking in those terms. You don't know, right, if it's going to be you or somebody else who's in this position. And we just need to have a responsive, reflexive system that can meet the needs. And, American society, I had no idea how much we struggle, actually. I wasn't looking at macro trends. I wasn't looking at, again, escalating suicide. I did not understand the sophistication of the cartels. I was always like, it's Hollywood. No, it's not. No, it's not. And so I think there's something that people don't understand either when they talk about different models where it goes well, harm reduction goes well. I'm like, but the cartels know where the money is. We're being flooded. And again, it's like, ideally, Americans wouldn't consume 40% of the illicit drug supply. Why do we do that? It's like, how do I make it so that we don't say yes to that to begin with? That vulnerability. But I think that I am somebody that thinks, it's like the love and fear thing. Positive change is always anchored in love and conviction. It is. And fear is not a valid premise for change. It's just not. I think we acknowledge the fear. I think that's what defund was about primarily. What if all cops are like this cop? And I had that same response, because there's so many things that I was just totally ignorant to. I grew up in Portland, Oregon. I was like, no, we solved racism in the 60s. I fully believed that, right? As a little white girl in a white town, it was just like, good job, everyone. And so I think a lot of my role specifically is sort of holding space for the grief and my personal regret, our failure to advocate appropriately, our failure to act in the interest of the greater good, to go, cool. And now what? Where do we go from here? We've learned a lot of stuff. Now is the season of post-traumatic growth. So thank you, honestly, for the conversation.
Thank you. Joe Cooper and Amy Barden, thank you so much for being part of our conversation. We wish you the very best of luck in the future.
Thank you. Thank you. Call anytime.
Thank you.
Conversation on Race and Policing has been supported by funding from the California State University San Bernardino College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Fall Library, and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Tin Lee is our technical consultant. Pamela Crossan provides administrative support, and Alan Yorba provides communication support. There's more information in the show notes, and please join us online at csusb.edu/CORP for upcoming programming, and find our catalog of over 100 past events with guests like Robin D.G. Kelly, Jamal Bowman, and Dorothy Roberts, and many more.